it's really amazing to see how the things changed, because at that time I couldn't imagine that I would ever present a lecture at this conference, and I also couldn't imagine that anyone would do it in English. So it's complicated. So I'll share my presentation. Please tell me if you don't hear me or something happens. The topic of my presentation is intragenetic typology and serial verb constructions in Qua as a case study. And the outline of the presentation is rather simple. First, I will give a number of methodological issues of the intragenetic typology, so to say, theory. Then I will introduce some patterns of serial verb constructions in Qua. This will be a kind of practice, and I will finish with a kind of general perspective, some concluding remarks. So first, I will speak of intragenetic typology as a field. First, we should start with the question what typology is as a whole. I think everyone knows here, so I will speak of it very briefly. But still, a linguistic typology is a domain of linguistic research that makes generalizations over linguistic variety as a whole. And in this perspective, the genealogical and geographical relationship between languages is not relevant. And a typologist deals with a language sample, usually a balanced language sample, and results of a typological study refer to the general population of the languages of the world, and further, it leads us to some conclusions of the human language as a phenomenon. Okay. And I have used here the term extragenetic typology in contrast to intragenetic typology. What is intragenetic typology or microtypology, as it is referred to sometimes? It's a domain where genealogical relationship is relevant. So we are speaking of comparing genealogically related languages. And this is not the same as historical linguistics, since we are not aiming at the proto-language reconstructions. We compare, so to say, synchronic states. And in this case, of course, we get no direct evidence for properties of the whole population of languages. But we get some evidence for properties of a particular language family or language group. And in fact, such comparative research was always typical for studies of particular language groups or families, such as Slavic studies, Germanic studies, Roman studies, and so on, Bantu studies, I don't know, Turkic studies. But now it is sometimes regarded as a part of linguistic typology. And it's in line with a general trend of crossing the borders of linguistic typology. I compare this, research domain with the domain of aerial typology, where geographical relationship is relevant and geographically related languages are compared. It's not in focus of my presentation now, but I should mention that in my case study, in my example, I will also deal with, and in a sense of, I will also deal with aerial typology, because the languages of Qua family make an area as well. And that's why it is not always so easy to distinguish between intragenetic typology and aerial typology. So intragenetic typology is a response to the problem that exists in linguistic typology. This is the problem of overlooking actual linguistic variety. Why I say so? I say so because extragenetic usual linguistic typology is always based on a relatively small language sample. Even we deal with a sample of hundreds of languages, it's not the same as taking into account all the linguistic variety. And by chance, the sample of a typological study typically includes more or less the same representatives of a genealogical unity. And that's clear why. Because if I'm a typologist and I'm comparing languages from different genealogical unities, I take into my sample the best described and documented languages with the most detailed accessible data. But in this case, the variety that any genealogical unity has itself is not taken into account, and that's not good. So I should mention the scholar who started speaking of the methodology of intragenetic typology. This was the late Alexander Evgenievich Kibrik, and here is the photo of him making a plenary lecture at the same conference about 15 years ago. I will not read the long quote where he explains that at least in some cases, it is reasonable to deal with a sample of genealogically related languages. But I will mention Kibrik's parameters of the typological research for which intragenetic typology is favorable. These are diachronic instability, and it means variety inside the genealogical unity. The second, relative rarity of the parameter and its representativeness in a specific language family. Complexity of a parameter. Kibrik mentions, for example, basic syntax of a language. And the cases where a parameter makes a scalar continuum and not just a binary parameter, yes, no. So in other words, complex, rare, and unstable things are better to be studied based on genealogically related languages, not in an abstract language sample. And just a quote from Greenberg, who also published a very early methodological paper in this domain. Everyone knows here, I think, main methodological issues for the linguistic typology in general. First of all, is it possible at all? Can we compare languages that are so different? What is language population in general? What is language sample? How we explain similarities between languages we get? And what is the explanatory power of the result of a taxonomic, typological, or comparative study? What is possibility at all? So when we deal with extragenetic typology, we discuss the problem of comparability of different systems. And I should draw your attention to the very recent introductory paper by Evans in the latest issue of Linguistic Typology. What are comparative concepts? What part of the language system can be compared at all? When we deal with intragenetic typology, we turn to a very funny thing. The possibility to do it at all has been never justified, but it has been never doubted. And in a sense, it has been taken for granted in its traditional form. So I have already mentioned, for example, Slavic studies. So no Slavicist ever doubted they can compare different Slavic languages. Why not? When we speak of the population, in the case of extragenetic typology, this is more or less clear that it is the population of all the existing and languages and all the documented extinct languages. And when we deal with the intragenetic typology, presumably the population are all the languages or maybe all the legs of the genealogical unity in focus. But if we think so, first of all, the genealogical unity should be more or less well established. Of course, it sounds trivial for Indo-European groups, but when we turn to Africa, and we will turn to Africa, it's not so self-evident. Second, the genealogical unity should not be too deep in order that the genealogical relationship between languages gives us something. They're still similar to one another, and therefore they are better comparable. Third, it's not very self-evident, but the internal genealogical classification is not so relevant because it's typically very disputable thing. And fourth, the typological homogeneity or heterogeneity of the genealogical unity is very relevant because if the unity is very heterogeneous, on the one hand, it's interesting to make a typology within it. On the other hand, it means that as a whole, it would not give us very different things than the extragenetic typology. There are different strategies of doing samples in linguistic typology. I will not go into details, but there are such known things as independency strategy, genealogical independency, error independency, variety strategy, random sample, of course, and such a thing as, so to say, maximum coverage sample. We just include as many languages as we can. It's not very theoretically based, but in fact, typologists know that typologists do this. Simply include the languages you have access to. What about intragenetic typology? So in an ideal case, we could simply make our sample the same as our genealogical units. But we start thinking, okay, we deal with languages, or we deal with all the dialects, or we also deal with all the subdialects. And in fact, we get the data accessibility problem. I am not aware of a family where all the dialects of all the languages are very perfectly documented. And more far we go from Europe, less such linguistic families we would get. So intragenetic typology also needs sampling, but the ratio of the sample and of the population is different. The sample takes a significant part of the population. So I can say more that in intragenetic typology, we still have different strategies with the samples, such as independency sample, and that's what has been done in Kibrick's studies on ergativity. Variety sample, including more languages with a structural variation of the parameter in focus. That's, for example, what Masha Konashenko has done in her dissertation. and the same maximum coverage sample. So we do as much as we can and hope to include in some brilliant future all the genealogical units. And it's more or less clear that using such an approach, it has more right to exist in intragenetic typology than in extragenetic typology. But anyway, the sample should be declared explicitly. We should not just assume that we deal with the genealogical unity, and that's clear. Okay. So when we conduct a typological study, we get with some differences and similarities between languages. And of course, when we deal with do intragenetic typology, we get differences between related languages that are of interest on their own. But still we get clusters that are based on similarity. With the big sample in extragenetic typology, clusters are linguistic types that should be explained by general factors. And in intragenetic typology, similarities can be differently. And there are at least three possibilities. First, this can be a case of a common inheritance from the proto-language. Second, the similarity can be contract-induced because genealogically related languages are frequently spoken in the same area, and because interference is easier between related languages. And third, similarities can be proper typological similarities that are a result of an independent evolution. Note that initially similar languages have prerequisites for limited variation in their evolution. So theoretically, all the three options exist in extragenetic typology as well, but usually we have no serious problems there to distinguish between these options. And in case of the intragenetic typology, it's not so trivial. And finally, explanatory power. Typology deals with universals or strong trends that say something about the human language in general. And extragenetic typology does it directly as it is based on a sample from the population of all the linguistic diversity. And intragenetic typology can make claims, of course, on the population of the genealogical unity. Such claims may be of some interest for historical linguistic studies, but have no interest for typology as a general domain of linguistics. So we can use this to extrapolate on the proto-language and on the process of evolution, or we have to look for other ways to get use of it for typology in general. And there are the following ways. On the one hand, intragenetic typology can be regarded as a pilot study, pilot typological study of languages with specific structural features, especially if we deal with a rare parameter. On the other hand, we can explain intragenetic tendencies of individual features through many more general universal factors. So we can look how universal things are reflected in the case of very family-specific context of a given genealogical unity. So the task of distinguishing what is influenced by universal factors and what is influenced by specific peculiarities of the genealogical unity in focus is a task of a linguist who does intragenetic typology. So now I go to the second part, serial verb constructions in Qua. What is serial verb constructions? You see here an example from Akan. Now this notion is more or less widely discussed in typological papers as well. Probably the most recent authors are Ihevand and Haspelmath, but there is a number of references. These are constructions where we have two or more finite verbs that have a common subject and are presumably analyzed as a single clause that express a single event or macro event and that share tense-aspect modality markers and negation if they have one. I will not go into details now. It is more or less clear. Now, what is Qua family? It's a family that is usually attributed as a part of Niger-Congo macrofamily. Roughly, you can see on the map where these languages are spoken in West Africa. The family consists of about 80 languages, and for 28 of them, I have got accessible data for the study. For some languages, more detailed data, for some languages, less detailed data. Some parameters that may be relevant. These are SVO languages, these are accusative languages. These are may ask someone to switch off the microphone. So they have no overt case marking for core cases. They have typically neutral ditransitives. So recipient and theme in ditransitive constructions are have no special flagging. They have poor non-finite forms in their grammatical system. So just a couple of words on more on the details of the classification. By Qua languages, I mean so-called new Qua. Since more than 40 years, this is taken for granted as a genealogical unity. No further significant discussion if these languages form a unity, although some details are still disputable. And internal classification is very disputable. So I prefer the cautious classification by Blanch. But what is important, there is a list of low-level genealogical unities, so to say groups, sometimes consisting of one or two languages, such as Abe or Adjukru or Atia. Some of them can consist of a number of languages, such as Gbe or Guang. And this will be relevant. And the parameter in focus, I will namely serial verb constructions, are present throughout the family. So I have no reason for variation sample, including some interesting options. And accessibility of the data does not correlate even with these mentioned clear low-level genealogical unities, so I have no chance for independency sample. That's why I take a maximum coverage sample as the only accessible, reasonable option. And details presented in accessible data are not the same for all languages. If I do not take into account languages with low detailed data, my sample will be too poor. That's why, in fact, I make a different subsample for every particular part of the study. And that is why in this study, there is no sense in even trying to make any quantitative claims. So this is how the sample looks like. Languages, their low-level genetic affiliation inside the qua family, a main area where the language is spoken, and sources of the data, sometimes a number of references on the language, sometimes just a single reference. What I will do, I will compare some parameters of qua-serial verb constructions, and in the languages of the sample where the data are accessible on this particular parameter. Then I will compare the results with low-level genealogical affiliation of the language, and then I compare the results with geographical position of the language. And I should mention that serial verb constructions are rather a complex parameter, so that's why, as Kubrick said, complex parameters are good for genetic typology. That's why this is good. And it's a relatively rare parameter. Not all language families have so widespread serial verb constructions. Of course, it's reasonable to study serial verb constructions in qua because they are widespread throughout the family and are, in a sense, a hallmark of qua family. Many other relevant parameters are fixed, such as SVO word order. And serial verb constructions in qua have a number of typical functions in addition to purely lexical serial verb constructions. So roughly, what kinds of serial verb constructions we have in qua? These are lexical, where the two verbs have more or less their lexical meaning in a serial verb constructions in the same way they are used on their own. There are idiomatic serial verb constructions when a combination of verbs has a non-compositional meaning that cannot be regularly derived as a sum of them. These are grammaticalized serial verb constructions, for example, using the verb turn as a marker of repetitive. And especially frequent are take serial verb constructions, such as in a example here. The woman put on the white dress. Literally, the woman took dress, white dress, put on, and give serial verb constructions such as in the example B. The man sold the house to the stranger. Literally, the man sold the house, gave the stranger. Of course, I have no time for speaking of all the parameters that can be relevant for qua-serial verb constructions, and even not all of them I want to speak of. That's why I have chosen three: expressing subject, expressing negation. These are structural issues of serial verb constructions in qua, and uses of take serial verb constructions, so some part related to their functions. Let's go to expressing subject. There are following strategies of qua-serial verb constructions, how the subject is expressed. So on the semantic level, the general definition of a serial verb construction that has a single shared subject is true. But it can be morphosyntactically, it can be expressed differently. So the most typical case is that the subject is expressed only once, such as this example. Here it is, here it is. as a full noun phrase or as a cross-reference marker. The second option is that the subject itself is expressed only once, but is cross-referenced on every verb in a serial verb construction. One more option. That's not, I have done a mistake. I'm really sorry. But multiple subject means that there should be a second verb in the serial verb construction where you have a pronominal expression. Okay. There can be variation of a single morphosyntactic subject and of multiple expression of the subject. For example, in Baule, you can say this pronominal expression 2 times. He has taken, he has given, or only once he has taken, given. And this single or multiple expression can depend on tense aspect modality marking. For example, in Tivule, you have only once, the subject expressed only once in future forms, but in imperfective forms, but it is repeated in future forms. The dog will catch, it will chew. Okay. So this is the table summarizing the ways of expressing subject in the sample. And I have highlighted the cases that are more or less rare, but not presented in a single language, such as single subject with multiple subject cross-reference, and where the multiple subject with the choice of single or multiple subject expression depends on a tense aspect modality form. And what's interesting here, that when we look roughly to these groups, we see that these languages have different low-level genetic affiliation, but are spoken roughly in the same area. But, and here we see that Leleme and Tafi are both spoken in southeast Ghana. But when we look to the map, we see that they are not still spoken in very contact areas, and they have other languages between them. And when we look for the case of depending of tense aspect modality, Tuvule and Chumburun, here is Western Ghana, but again, these are not very, very neighboring languages on the map. So we can conclude that in this particular story, this is a significant, we have a significant variation of structural possibilities of serial verb constructions. And there is no correlation of rare possibilities, both with the neurological and areal factors, because even when languages belong roughly to the same area, they are not closest neighbors. So tentatively, we have an example of a purely typological similarity driven by an independent evolution, although, of course, it's a tentative conclusion. Now we go to expressing negation in quasi-serial verb constructions. There are the following strategies. Symmetric expression of negation on both verbs. As in Leleme, you have the negation marker on both of them. Zero expression, where you have it only on one verb. A frame negation, where you have a negation marker that consists of 2 parts, and one of them is preceding all the serial verb construction, and the other one is following it. And a consecutive strategy where the choice of the marking on the okay, it's not a good example as well, but the choice of the marking of the second verb depends on the marking of the first verb. Okay, so frame and consecutive are rare options, but zero and symmetric are tested in some lists of qua languages. And we see that here we have a correlation of the two main strategies with the genealogical affiliation. And more rare strategies are individual features of separate languages. And no cases we have in this particular parameter of typological similarity so far. So we assume that here we deal with single cases of language involution. So that's the choice done once, for example, in Proto-Avatini-Nyangbe or Proto-Guanca, so on. Of course, this does not mean that it is always the case of expression negation in serial verb constructions, and even in qua, because it's just a sample. And now we go to take serial verb constructions. There are actually three types of them in qua, namely lative ones that where you literally say take come, and this means bring, or take go means carry, and so on. Instrumental ones where the verb take introduces an instrument, as in example B, and objectal ones where the verb take introduces the theme or the patient of the lexical verb. Let's go to lative serial verb constructions. They can be introduced with inanimate objects. This means bring or carry, or with animate objects as well, taking someone. And here we have a table with the sample. There are languages where neither option is used. There are languages where lative serial verb constructions are used with inanimate objects, but not with animate ones. And there are languages where we have both. And we see that although some genealogical groupings work, all of them are tested in both groups. So you have the languages here and one of them here. A South Guang language here and South Guang language here. Bia languages here and Bia languages here. So we have a short hierarchy that has no correlation with areal and factors and no total correlation with genealogical factors. So this presumably is an example of a pure typological similarity driven by an independent evolution. And the pattern of lative serial verb constructions themselves seems to be areal or genealogical, but many more widespread in the languages of West Africa. And the expansion from inanimate objects to animate objects seem to be a universal pattern of any lative constructions, not obligatorily those that are serial verb constructions with the verb take. Now let's go to instrumental take serial verb constructions. Again, they can be used for a number of more detailized functions. First, they can introduce an instrument proper, such as an X, fill the tree with an X. They can introduce manner, clever, literally took cleverness. They can introduce a consumable substance, take wood, build house with this wood. And they can be used to introduce, to have a commutative meaning, to introduce secondary participant of the event with someone. Here my table is long. It will take 2 slides. First of all, those where there are no commutative functions, but languages that have instrument and manner, and instrument and manner and consumable, and those where there are commutative uses. And again, we have all the 3 options on the instrument and manner and consumable. And if we look to those having commutative, we see that, okay, we have attested this in Akan, but the other 4 languages belong to southwestern Côte d'Ivoire as the genealogical affiliation. And now it's differently than in the case I have shown with subject expression, because in fact these are 4 languages that are widespreadly used in this area, virtually in the Kwa-speaking area of the southwest of Côte d'Ivoire, that are clearly contacting with one another. So, with these constructions, we have 2 hierarchies: instrument, manner, and consumable, and instrument and commutative. And commutative use develops independently from manner and consumable, and both paths of semantic development of instrument meanings and of commutatives from instruments seem to be universal, not obligatorily for take-serial word constructions, but still error pattern is clear in the commutative use for 4 languages of 5, those having such uses of instrumental take-serial verb constructions. And now object take-serial verb constructions. So the verb take can be used to introduce the object of the following lexical verbs: the transitives, took, showed, a locative verb with a locative valency, for example, took, take, lay, agentive monotransitive verb, for example, take clothes or take put, or I don't know, a volative non-agentive monotransitive verb, for example, hold, and a non-volative monotransitive lexical verb, such as resemble. And according to the data, the list I have presented is what is a hierarchy again. So there are languages for which, at least in the data presented in the sources, only the transitive uses are tested. Those the transitives and verbs with locative valences, the transitives, locatives, and adjectives, the transitives, locatives, adjectives, and volatives, the transitives, locatives, adjectives, volatives, and other monotransitives. Genealogical and error factors may be influenced, but only partially. I have no time to go into details of this table. What is important, we have crucial differences between closely related languages here, such as the languages here, for example. Okay, so we have a typological variety here and attested options from a hierarchy. I have already spoken of it, but where does it come from? And when we start looking at this hierarchy, we see that we can list a number of factors that could trigger this hierarchy. First of all, this is the grammaticalization path and the basic metaphor related to the lexical meaning of the verb take. Agentive verbs are closer to the meaning of manual manipulation. Second, the very general principle of distinctiveness. The transitives are neutral in qua, and locatives are sometimes neutral. So the languages use the verb take as a marker to distinguish between different valences. And the factor of transitivity in the sense of Hopper and Thompson's, that the more semantically transitive is verb, the more relevant is marking its object. So very different patterns work together and give this, I think, more or less nice hierarchy inside the quasi-language family. So now my concluding remarks, doing again a more general perspective, but with the experience of having gone into the details of such a case study based on the sample of qua languages. First, my maximum coverage sample works. So we have got results that sound reasonable based on all the existing data on the linguistic family. So I tried to squeeze out everything I could, and I think it was not in vain. One can distinguish between inheritance, contact influence, and independent evolution, at least tentatively, even based on existing classification and existing geographic data. I can say I did not go into details of these low-level genealogical units myself, and on the details of what is reported on language context of these language communities, but still looking on the classification and looking on the map, we can get something. And at least tentatively, we can connect family-specific results of an intragenetic cross-linguistic study with a more general perspective of things that are presumed to be universal. What can one do next to this case study exactly? So I have done such a study of serial verb constructions in qua. What next? Of course, it would be reasonable to study the same parameters in other genealogical unities. Namely, okay, I have studied serial verb constructions in qua. Let me study serial verb constructions in other languages, and let me test the expectation that what is based on universal parameters of universal patterns also works. And in a very preliminary form, I have already done this, and I have conducted a preliminary study of text serial verb constructions also in Gur languages and in Benue-Congo languages, including so-called Old Kwa, languages that are very similar to Kwa in their structure. Yes, the patterns that are assumed to be more or less universals also work there. And we can test the expectation that what is based on language-specific patterns would differ. Now it's an open question for me, but we will do our best. And finally, the concluding slide, in fact, returning to the general idea of intragenetic typology. What it does is combining typological tradition and traditions dealing with specific language families. And this process of combination happens anyway and exists in all research communities. But what we should do, we should try to take best things that we can get from this. Those dealing with specific language families or areas should try to give something to typology, and typologists can and should go into details of linguistic genealogical unities, not with just a sample. And That's why conceptualizing traditional comparison of related languages as a part of linguistic typology, in my opinion, helps both of them. And it's a real way to introduce finally linguistic variety into linguistic typology. I'm sure that at least in some cases I have taken into account some details that come from descriptions that have been done maybe a century ago, but were not in focus of typology or general linguistics. Just a couple of references to my work, if one is interested to details I have published on these topics. And thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for this interesting talk. And I think Petya Arkadiev has got a question or a comment, so let's find out.
Okay, Petya, you pronounce it yourself, or I should read?
Well, if you can hear me, then I can say a few words. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because actually I was told that I'm not so well heard as I had expected, so I'm not sure. Okay, so could you please elaborate a little more on your point in the beginning that internal genealogical classification of a family is not relevant? It seems to me that even this statement somewhat contradicts what you've actually done, because in your qua case study, you consistently informed us about the genealogical subgrouping. So could you please clarify what exactly you mean?
What? Okay, Peter, that's a good point. Maybe I should really express this in a better form. What I mean is that, for example, with qua languages, we more or less know since Bennett and Sterk what qua languages are, and we more or less know with low-level genealogical unities, such as listed on my slide, such as Gbe, Guang, and so on. But what we really don't know is how these low-level genealogical unities group with one another. There is a number of classifications. Researchers always quarrel with one another and even fight. And I see no perspective that one gets to concord in such questions. And what's really amazing, that's as far as I know, that's a typical situation in every internal classification, starting from Indo-European, such as discussions on Balto-Slavic unity. Is there this unity or not? And so on and so on. So that's what my idea is, that what we should better do is to ignore this level of intermediate classifications into branches and sub-branches. Just for practical reasons, we have no non-speculative basis to deal with.
Okay, thank you. And Emmanuel has got 2 questions, please.
Okay, thank you. The first question I have, when you talk about parameters, do you mean them in a generativist fashion? You mean when you talk about parameters, do you hear me?
Only partially. So I hear when you talk about parameters, and
Yes.
I don't hear the second part.
Okay, when you're talking about parameters, are you talking about them in a generativist fashion, i.e. the principal and parameters approach, or not?
I think not. I'm talking about parameters of classification in a very general sense, because well, typology is classification. For classifying anything, you need some parameters. I do not mean something more special.
Okay, okay, fine. And the second question is, how do you deal with what Rakoff calls bibliographic bias, which you posited in a different way on slide 7? And how do you overcome such a bias, i.e. Analyzing languages of which you don't have data? And how do you deal with a specific parameter such as the serialized verb construction if you don't have a language which does not show it, in order to see what happens if there is a genealogically similar language which has not such a construction? Thank you.
Well, I think I have spoken of it, but maybe very too briefly. But my idea is that I even do not try to overcome what I cannot overcome. I have mentioned that I even do not try to make any quantitative statements, simply because there is such a problem of the genealogical bias. But for the second part of your question, I can say that what's really important, that when we deal with the genealogical unity, we actually, it makes no sense of saying that such or such, for example, qua language could not exist. Is it possible to have a qua language without serial verb constructions? Even if we imagine that we have documented all the family and we have discovered ones in all the qua languages so far. Of course, in fact, I know the question. Of course, I know the answer. Of course, it is possible that a single qua language in its evolution loses serial verb constructions. So there is no sense in thinking of such a theoretical possibility. In contrast, of course, to some questions that are related to the extragenetic typology, where, of course, you have to deal with logically possible options that are not really possible in the languages of the world.
Thank you.
Okay, Nikita Muravyov, please.
Yes, thank you for an interesting presentation. I have a general question. When we are doing an intragenetic typology, how deep should we dig into, languages, dialects, and subdialects, given that we have data on them? Suppose we have many different branches and many dialects and subdialects, and where should we maybe stop? At what level should we stop while doing this?
So when you speak of depth, you speak of depth in the level of very closely related lects, not in the depth of microfamilies. Yeah. Okay. So I don't know, but what I can say is that what we maybe should at least try to control that we do it more or less consistently. So if we deal with, let me give an imaginable example that if we take into account a very detailed study, for examples of dialects of Russian, we should not have a sample of dialects of Russian and, for example, the Czech language, but no other Slavic languages. That will not be a good sample.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, this sounds trivial when I give such an example, or with the Slavic languages. That's not extremely trivial when we deal with less studied areas and unities.
Okay. Right, a comment by Dima Gerasimov, please.
Thank you. Just a brief comment following the discussion after Peter's question, if I may. I think that, we used to think that the present distribution of features on the planet has not been created overnight, but results from like a certain history of changes in the languages of the world. And I think that one of the, and so it's in part dependent on the sort of the typology of changes. And I think that one of the one of the primary strengths of intragenetic typology and reasons why we so badly need it for like the big extragenetic typology is precisely in that we know that these languages are related and stem from the same source, and that like makes the study of their variation a window into so to say the typology of changes.
Yes. I draw your attention to my quote from Greenberg.
Yep. Mm-hmm. True.
I have nothing to add to what Greenberg had formulated.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, any more questions? I've got a simple question about the data that you showed. So the construction with the take, you had an example, something like take, book, write. Is it possible other constructions without the verb take, which express the same situation? Can you just say write a book in the languages?
Yes, you can. These details differ in different languages, and there are tendencies that independent uses of lexical verbs sometimes are restricted depending on some features of the object, especially exactly with ditransitive constructions. That's a very different story, but sometimes there are contexts when you only have to use these constructions with the verb take. But in general, all these transitive verbs can be used in qua languages on their own. Maybe except for, in UQua languages, to the best of my knowledge, according to the data of the studies, virtually yes for all of them.
Okay, thank you. And can the same construction with the verb take be used to express carative meanings without something, with negation? Or what's the way to express carative meaning in the common language?
I'm not sure I'm ready to speak of caratives right now, but this construction is not used in this function.
Okay.
Well, at least typically, I cannot be absolutely sure now that that it is never attested in a single language, but I do not remember such uses. And anyway, they are not typical. If they were typical, they were a part of my study.
Okay, thank you. So I think we should move to Slack for any further discussions now. And after a short break, we're going to have another talk, which is of a new genre for this conference. It's a project presentation. And we thank our speaker now. So please come back here at 5:50. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention and for discussion. And again for inviting me.